Good morning to you. In behalf of Mike Glenn, our senior pastor, the congregation at Brentwood Baptist Church, our ministers, staff, our wonderful tech team that's leading us today, and our facilities team, welcome. We're glad that you're here. I'm Ken Core. I'm the congregational care minister, and I want to extend to you a very special welcome because we want you to have a good experience here today, and I hope that this will be everything that you had hoped and everything that you need. In just a minute, I'm going to lead us in a prayer as we begin this time together. But let me also say, we've got lots of breakfast foods in the back. We've got coffee over here, soft drinks, water. If you need restrooms, go out these doors right here and turn left, and you'll find the restrooms that should be right there. So let's begin our time together, and let's pray. Loving God, we come aside this morning in this sacred space to learn. We come aside this morning for a time to grow. We come aside this morning because our lives have been touched by trauma. We come aside this morning to heal. And we have come aside this morning to be taught and led by your divine Spirit. So teach us, lead us, heal us, and bless us, we pray. Amen. Amy Alexander is the founder and director of the Refuge Center, who is hosting this event. Let me introduce to you Amy Alexander.
Good morning, everyone. Hello, we are so glad that you are here. Welcome to the Refuge Center's Live Intentionally speaker series. We truly cannot imagine a year where this content is more needed. So we are so blessed to have each of you with us this morning. Some of you are very familiar with the Refuge Center. Some of you are still getting to know us, but we were founded in 2005. Our goal is simply to provide excellent and affordable care to those in need. We provide services for nearly 4,000 people each year, around 33,000 counseling sessions, and all of that is done on a sliding fee scale based on income so that anyone can access the care that they need. We get a tremendous number of referrals for those seeking support around anxiety, depression, grief and loss, post-traumatic stress, marital crisis, addictions issues, and we also serve children and teens ages 4 and up. We've been doing Live Intentionally for a number of years, and it connects us back to our core values, which are around educating the community. That's one of our values, and this is a way that we give back to our community and just continue the conversation around mental health. We have around 100 people that will be joining us this morning live and over 100 that will be joining us virtually, so we'd like to welcome them to this event as well. We here at Refuge Center have a trauma-informed model, and it's important to us to be sure that our community feels empowered in the language around mental health. So we're very glad to have you today. We're going to show you a brief video about what the Refuge Center is and does, and then I'll be back up to welcome our speakers and thank our sponsors. Thank you so much. In 2005, when Jennifer Gillette and I co-founded the Refuge Center for Counseling, our heart was to create a place that when you come to the Refuge Center, you really will receive the very best access to care and to healing.
We did so much just from blind faith and hope without knowing how tall the mountain was going to be. And we knew that we wanted to keep expanding and growing to help people, but we didn't know how boundaryless that vision would become.
I am at the Refuge Center because I absolutely love being here. I love our mission.
Our heart was to create a place that did a couple of things. One would be a systemic organization where we could serve the entire family in one place. And the other was to pair excellence and affordability.
Our therapists come from a wide variety of different backgrounds and modalities that they're trained in. And we also offer many opportunities throughout the year for our therapists to engage in continuing education opportunities.
So suffering, loss, mental health, emotional health issues, these are human experiences that don't discriminate. That is something everyone can relate to. We know mental health needs and access are on demand and on the rise, and the affordability aspect is huge. That is what can come between somebody and the help they need.
The need is definitely so great, not just in Williamson County, but from all the counties.
You never know who's going through hard times, right? You just never know, but everybody is.
Oh, the Refuge Center is such a powerful influence in the community, in the healing and the gift that it brings in its ministry to help people in many walks of life and many different types of issues.
Anxiety, depression, grief and loss, traumatic bereavement, domestic violence, sexual abuse, the list goes on.
Play therapy is just an opportunity for younger kids who don't have the verbal ability quite yet. Recently started using neurofeedback here, also called EEG biofeedback. So be able to bring it here and be able to have that accessible on a sliding fee scale is something I haven't really heard of any other place. So I'm pretty excited to be a part of that.
When I was sitting at the banquet and heard that this was available here on a sliding scale, I felt passionate about letting other people know that that exists. Even people who are making a good salary can't afford $220 a week. That's almost $1,000 a month. It's too much.
There's so many good organizations around Middle Tennessee to be supportive of, and as a community we're fortunate for that. And I spent the last 20 years in healthcare, and specifically in behavioral healthcare, so in my business I know what a huge need the Refuge Center provides. And across our country there's just an amazing amount of shortage of services, so it just resonated with me immediately. I knew this was an organization that I could get behind and really feel good about.
We have people who need our services, who are hearing about us and want to get in. And we are just really needing more people to come along to work beside us to help in closing that gap financially.
One of the things we know is that when we don't transform our pain, we begin to transmit it. And so the greatest contribution that the Refuge Center gives to this community is empowering people to have their pain transformed.
You know, as our light shines brighter, someone else gets to see more light, and it's inspiring, it's encouraging, and it just gives hope that, oh, maybe what's possible for you is also possible for me in my pain.
Hope grows at the Refuge Center because other people believe in us and support the mission.
Because of the staff that's constantly being developed.
It means support to me. It means I am not alone, my family's not alone.
When one person gets healthy, the family system gets healthier and stronger, and that creates healthier communities. There really is this ripple effect that occurs. And over the years, the Refuge Center has provided services to thousands and thousands of people, making this community so much stronger. Lives that will be saved, lives that will be transformed, people that will live from a place of kindness and love rather than living out of their pain.
Get the word out and let people know what's happening here.
You deserve intentional, professional, excellent, cutting-edge care, regardless of your income level and regardless of your need.
Well, that's a brief introduction to the Refuge Center. I think before I dive into logistics, I'd like to just start with a quick activity. So all of you should have a notebook or a notepad in front of you. If you would just open it to the first fresh page and write down 3 sentence stems. This is going to connect to what you hope to receive from today. This is called Live Intentionally, so we're going to start with intention. So your 3 sentence stems are I feel, I want, I need. I feel, I want, I need. And that is related to your experience here this morning. So I'm just going to pause and give all of you a minute or two to complete those stems. Take your time. If you're still writing, that's fine. This activity will help you to be discerning as you're listening today and knowing what to get from the content. I do want to thank our sponsors who've helped us make this possible. Those sponsors are Williamson Medical Center, Pinnacle Financial Partners, Chris Elrod Realtor, LBMC Employment Partners, Abound Wealth, K-Love, and of course our host, Brentwood Baptist Church. I want to share just momentarily here about post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic wisdom. Many people go through trauma and come out with a diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But we know that that is not inevitable. That doesn't have to occur. And a lot of that depends on the amount of support we have as we're going through stressful things and our ability to cathart or release the negative energy of those experiences. But post-traumatic growth is what can happen when we experience a traumatic event that challenges our core beliefs. It's when we endure psychological struggle and ultimately have personal growth. And I've said it so often over the last year and a half, not only physically have we gone through a pandemic, a tornado, a flood, a bombing, but emotionally we have experienced a pandemic, a flood, a bombing, a tornado. That's the emotional experience we're having. So COVID has really leveled the playing field, and people who before might not have said they ever really understood what anxiety or depression was, I doubt there'd be a person anywhere alive right now who, if they're being honest, wouldn't say that they've struggled at some level this year. The result of post-traumatic growth is an appreciation of life, deeper relationships, openness to new possibilities. We've seen a lot of people reevaluating their career, their location, their time with family, increased inner strength, and also spiritual change. At the Refuge Center this year, we have the theme of wisdom. Every year we have a theme to the year, and we are defining wisdom as knowing where to apply our energy. That's how we're defining wisdom. And post-traumatic growth allows us to do the same thing, reevaluate where we want to invest our energy. But this doesn't happen accidentally. You won't go through these experiences and just one day wake up and find that you've grown. It only happens with intention. So we have to do therapy. We have to engage in prayer, journaling, groups, mornings like this conference. So each of you has already set an intention to grow through your struggles. And so I hope you will give yourself credit for that this morning. I'm excited to welcome our incredible panel of speakers. In your programs, there are detailed bios for each of them, so I won't restate all of those details. But Trillian Small is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She is a renowned speaker, including her work with TEDx. She's an author and a coach. Dr. Ebony Webb is a PsyD. She's the founder and primary therapist of the Village of Kairos, which is a local organization. Ken Core is an MDiv and MS. He's also the congregational care pastor here at Brentwood Baptist. We have Rob Fitzpatrick, LPC MHSP, working with our juvenile justice system. And Caitlin Coyle, who is the director of our contract and children's team here at the Refuge Center. So she oversees all of our therapists that work with minors ages 4 to 18. So let me begin by welcoming Trillian Small to the stage.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? Love it. I know it's a little early. How's everyone doing? There we go. Awesome. Got your coffee? You ready? Awesome. So September 11th at 4 a.m. is when I began preparing for this talk, 4 a.m. Not because I was overly eager, but because I was hurt. I was confused, and I was laying in bed at 4 a.m. asking, how long? How long am I going to be single? I know, shocker, right? I surprise myself every single time. every time I say that, I am like, wow, that is a shocker. So go ahead, pull out your cameras, take a picture, send it to your nephews, your sons, your friends. I date cross-culturally, so we're good there. But at 4 a.m., tears are welling in my eyes, and I'm wrestling with the thought that every other area in my life seems to be going well and smooth, except for the relationship department, which seems to need WD-40 every single day. And so I lay there with the question, how long? Have you ever had that question? How long? How long is COVID going to last? How long is this person going to treat me this way? How long? And so I lay there wondering, how long? As Amy said, I am a mental health therapist. I actually did my internship with the Refuge Center about 8 years ago. And my current clients are between the ages of 25 and 55. And after the first couple of sessions, I learned their story, and I realized that their first notable traumatic relationship experience, which all are notable, happened between the age of 3 and 9 years old. So for my younger clients, that means they've spent maybe 16 to 26 years, and for the older clients, maybe they've spent 46 to 52 years trying to heal from what happened when they were 3 to 9 years old. 16 to 52 years. That's a long time. How long have you been waiting? I have clients who sit in my office and they just say, either they say it or they feel it, and I can pick up on it. They say, Dr. Small, I'm just waiting. The little girl, that little boy on the inside of me is just sitting here waiting, hoping for somebody to come and just hold me and tell me, it's going to be okay. I got you. But no one ever comes. And so they sit and they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait. And 20, 30, 40, 50 years now has passed, and they're still waiting, hoping for love and guidance and help. But here you guys are. You're still fighting. You're still believing. You're still striving to learn. But you think you're lagging behind, not realizing that you have 20, 30, 40 years of past experiences riding on your shoulders. So it's very interesting. Sometimes the very things that we are struggling with today, the very things that we are fighting today, are the mistakes that someone else made who dropped us. Yeah, they dropped the ball. They dropped the ball. Intentionally or unintentionally, they dropped the ball. And here you are fighting, trying to make right what was made wrong, and you probably didn't even have a choice in it in the first place. So what do? Some people, they don't do anything. They just wait, and they wait, and they wait. So how long? How long are you going to wait? There are so many times where the very things, whether it's anxiety, depression, PTSD, the way you cope with stress, there are so many times where it's not even your weight. Possibly it could have been passed down to you, and we call that epigenetics. Epigenetics is simply the study of your emotions, your behavior, and your experiences that can tweak and alter your genetic makeup. So let's say you had 3 people standing here. For the sake of time, I won't call up any volunteers. But let's say you had yourself to the right, to your left. You had the middle person, which is your parent. And then on the far left, you had your grandparents. Your grandparents could have had an experience that altered their genetic makeup. So if I have this light here, we're going to call this a DNA tag. DNA tag, that's what we call it. So let's say grandmother or grandfather had an experience that tweaked their genetic makeup. She then would have your mother, and she passed it down. The light is not activated yet, but the tag is on the DNA. Maybe grandmother or mother went through a little bit more. It's a little bit heavier now, right? So it's about to activate Let's call this your anxiety sensitivity. Mother goes through a little bit more, and then she has you. And now one thing or two things or three things happen in your life. The right relationship trigger happens in your life, and it activates your anxiety sensitivity. And you're wondering, where did this come from? Right? You're wondering, where does this come from? Not realizing it's years and years and years of weight that have been on your shoulder. Belief systems that we believe year after year after year. So is it possible that the relationship wounds that we are still trying to heal are still lagging and lingering on because of some erroneous belief that we have yet to release? But we hold on to it because of what somebody said or what somebody did. I have a nephew. His name is Isaiah. I have several nephews. But one of them, his name is Isaiah. And several years ago, he was about the age of 5 or 6 or so. We were at a buffet, and it was one with the good food, not with the leftover food. And about 5 or 6 years old, we sat at the table, we had our food, but we forgot the drinks and we forgot the silverware. And so we left him there, and his father said, his father said, "Hey, Isaiah, watch the food, and we'll be right back." So we went, we grabbed the drinks, we grabbed the water, and we come back, and he's literally doing this. And we're like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "Dad, you told me to watch the food." This little guy, 5, 6 years old, is literally watching the food. He took and he believed what he believed his father to say at face value. How many things are you taking at face value that somebody said? They left you. Yeah, they left you. But you take that at face value to believe that no one will ever love you. So you stop living and you stop loving. That person only appraises you and only appeases and only feels appeased and seems appeased when you do perfect. So therefore you just say, "You know what? I'm not going to try anymore. Because at least if I don't try, I won't fail, I won't make a mistake, and I won't be a disappointment." How long? How long are we going to choose to swallow bitterness and resentment and hurt? How long are we going to? How long are we going to choose to believe a lie that someone either said or we interpreted their behavior? How long? And I know you may be saying, "Dr. Small, I didn't choose to be hurt. I didn't choose to be abandoned. I didn't choose to be neglected." I know you didn't choose to. One of my favorite quotes, I have several favorite quotes. One of my favorite quotes is, "Our greatest sufferings comes from the lies and the stories that we tell ourselves based on what someone has done or has not done." What lie have you been believing? Although we aren't staring at food, we all have proverbial food that we're staring at. Like, well, they said it, it must be true. They did it, it must be true. But life is passing on. Life has continued, and now you have compounding interest on what happened to you from the ages of 3 to 9 years old. And I know you say, like I said, you didn't choose it. But we now have a choice. We now have a choice in what we do with what happened to us, what we do with what was said. The belief that we focus on will determine if we will heal and grow or if we will stay stuck. So how long is long enough? How long is long enough? Last month, September 11th, August 11th, 4 a.m., I was laying in bed with tears welling in my eyes. But all of a sudden, I got excited. You're like, "Wait a minute, you were just crying." I know. Emotions can shift. 4 a.m., I was tears welling in my eyes, but all of a sudden I got excited because I said, trillion. Taking into consideration where you started, you're doing pretty good to me. taking into consideration where you started, the weight that you had on your shoulders, taking into consideration where you started, you're doing pretty good. You're doing pretty good. But the question now is, what do we do about it, right? So I realized that there are 3 things. I call it rule. Sorry, my English teachers, I'm going to chop off the E. It's just going to be R-U-L, but it's still pronounced rule. There were 3 things that I realized I had to work through. R stands for relearn. U stands for unlearn. And you've guessed it. L stands for learn. I'm going to give you one for each to make it very simple on you, and give you one way to relearn, unlearn, and learn. The one common thing that I've learned that individuals need to relearn when it comes to healing from either childhood, teenage, or adult trauma is how to rethink. Anybody been a kid before? Right, no, silly question. Everybody's been a kid. You remember as a child where somebody stole your ball and you cried for a little bit, but then they gave it back, or you got another one, and guess what? You act as if that ball was non-existent. How do children do that, right? They feel, and then they let it go. They experience it, and then they let it go. As we get older, I think we forget how to do that. How to feel it, and then let it go. How to feel it, and then let it go. One way you can do this, I made this word up, memory abstinence. Of course, the word abstinence normally is to refrain from intimate pleasures, but memory abstinence essentially is you refraining from ruminating over and over and over again about the thoughts and the memories that aren't serving you. Memory abstinence. So when a memory or a thought comes up, if it serves you well, keep it. If it doesn't, ask yourself, is this going to help me? Thinking about this, is it going to help me? If the answer is no, memory abstain. I abstain. You can even say that to yourself. Nope. Memory, I abstain. I abstain. The second one is unlearn. There are many things we can unlearn. One of them being the conditioning, emotional conditioning to our body. Many of us think that we have to just take what our body is feeling at face value. Yes, you have the anxiety in your chest, and you've probably been conditioned to interpret anxiety in chest, heart beating, that means I'm anxious, oh gosh, now it's time to freak out. How many's done that before? Just me? No, got a couple people. I'm not the only one who freaks out at time to time. One of the things that I've learned is I can feel it. I can ask it, hey heart, you're beating really fast. I think you're about to be a little anxious. Tell me what's going on. What just happened? So what may help is to use gentle touch. Wherever you feel that emotion, instead of just hiding or running or avoiding it, just simply stop. Let's say, let's just do it now. Where does anxiety normally live in your body? Just kind of think about that to yourself. I see some people holding their hands to their chest. And so if you're anxious, and I see some shoulders, good. So just place your hand wherever anxiety normally lives, and you can say, anxiety, I hear you. Something just happened. Tell me what happened. And then ask yourself, what do you need? So in replacement of anxiety, sometimes you need peace, calmness. So I want you to imagine peace or calmness. Imagine it your favorite color. Maybe it's green or pink or fuchsia, whatever you like. And just imagine it flowing through your hands into that place, whether it was your shoulders, your chest, or wherever it is. And allow that color to fill that space with the color of peace and calmness. Let's say anger. Let's say it lives in your fist. I know mine lives in my jaw. If anger lives in your fist, just simply clench them. Just notice it. You're like, oh, I'm so angry. Feel it. We're not running from it. Feel it. Clench, but then let it go. And you can literally do that. I have clients, I'm like, feel it. I had one client, I said, hey, when you're feeling anxious or you're feeling angry or whatever, feel it for 7 minutes. I don't know if that's research-based. I just said 7 minutes. Maybe it takes 2 minutes. Maybe it takes 12. I don't know. Test it out. Feel it. Let it go. Feel it. Let it go. Right? so that you begin to retrain your body to know, oh, this doesn't mean I'm in danger. It just means I'm having an emotional reaction to something that has happened, and I can let it go, right? And then we have L. L stands for learn. What are things that we need to learn as we are going through this healing process? And I know I'm specifically talking about relationships, but you, of course, can apply this to any area of your life. What is something that we need to learn? One of the things I like to encourage clients is to learn and be intentional about your behaviors, right? Yes, what happened then happened, and you may say, well, I'm walled in because of them. They said that, so that's why I'm walled in. It's their fault, right? Or I run from love because of what Joe did or what Billy Bob did. How many people have made a mistake in a relationship? Or have had relationship trauma? Many of us, right? How many of you married or are still dating your mistake? Just kidding. Don't look. Look ahead. Blink twice. Just kidding. If that mistake, and I'm going to give you your L, don't worry. You're like, she forgot the L. I'm coming back to it. If that mistake is still driving your choices and your behaviors, and it's dictating your decisions or lack thereof, it's not over. It's not over. It still lives on in your head and in your heart. So again, how long do we want past experiences to take up real estate? Real estate is booming now. But how much do we want our past experiences to take up real estate in our hearts and in our minds? So L is learn. One of the things we can learn is how to effectively drop pebbles. So if you've been to a lake, you've probably dropped a pebble or two in the water, and then you experience the ripple effect. Every single behavior we have, boop, is a pebble in the water, and the ripple effect are the consequences that will ensue. So I want you to ask yourself every single day, to be intentional, what pebble do I want to drop today? Boop, that's going to affect the next 1, 2, 3, 10 years and my life. Not only your life, remember epigenetics, what you do today, if you plan on having kids, you pass it on down. You can possibly pass it down. So if you plan on having kids, now is a beautiful time to work through all of those past traumas, all of those wounds. And you may say, oh gosh, well, did I ruin my kids? I already had them. No, it's not too late, right? Because they can still choose. They can still choose to heal. So what pebbles do you want to drop? Just because years in past you ran, you hid, you avoided, it doesn't mean you have to today. Is dropping pebbles easy? Of course it's not easy. It doesn't have to be too hard though. It's just making an intentional decision, asking yourself, in 1 year, in 2 years, in 5 years, who do I want to be? If you still want to be the avoidant, attached individual who's just like, stay over there, don't come close. If you still want to be the individual that allows what happened 16 to 52 years ago to impact you, that's your choice. But I'm begging you to feel it and then let it go. Feel it, then let it go. Does that mean create amnesia? Of course it doesn't. But as you go through, hopefully on a weekly, maybe daily, weekly at least, monthly basis, asking yourself, from this experience, do I need to relearn anything? Do I need to unlearn something? And then what can I learn from this? Chew the meat, spit out the bones. Does this feel like it's going to be an easy feat for you guys? Maybe. So let's just practice. I want you just to close your eyes. If you're not comfortable closing your eyes, you can just gaze down at the table and downcast your eyes. I just want you to think of one belief, one I am statement that you tell yourself consciously or subconsciously. I have to be perfect. I have to please everyone. I'm not good enough. I'm a failure. What is it? What's yours? And then ask yourself, how long have I been believing this? How long? Notice where you feel that thought in your body. It'll help to identify what emotion is attached to that thought. Whether it's anxiety or fear or hopelessness. Now ask yourself, has it been long enough? Has it been long enough that this memory or this thought has been dictating what I do or not do? Is it long enough? And if the answer is yes, it's been long enough, ask yourself, is there anything from this memory or this belief that I can possibly relearn? If the thought was, I'm not good enough, what would you like to relearn? Maybe it's, hey, I'm trying. I'm good enough as I am. What do you want to relearn? Is there anything you want to unlearn? If you said, I'm a failure, maybe you want to unlearn the belief that mistakes aren't okay. And then finally, what do you want to learn? Maybe you want to learn, wow, I'm a strong person. What is it that you want to learn? And I want you to now imagine yourself embodying that new belief. And if it helps you, you can touch that part of your body where you're possibly experiencing an emotional reaction. And just show some love to that space. Show some love to that space. Say, I'm here for you. I love you. Now, once you've imagined yourself embodying that loving, compassionate, courageous person, I want you to take a deep breath in. Fill your lungs and let it out. And deep breath in. And let it out. And one more deep breath in. And let it out. And when you are ready, you can open your eyes and come back to the room. How did that feel? How did it feel? Now is a good time. The past is gone, the present is now. Hopefully the future comes. The only moment we have is now. And so it's my hope that you all choose yourself. God bless.
Good morning, everyone. As Amy said, my name is Caitlin Coyle. I'm the current director of the Child and Teen Program at the Refuge Center. Currently have about 10 people on our team. Several of them are here today, so thanks for coming, guys. We are using EMDR, play therapy, TFCBT to meet the needs of young people in the Middle Tennessee area. Last year, about 17% of the clients seen at Refuge were between the ages of 4 and 18. So what that translates to is about 730 clients or 5,700 sessions seen by clinicians at Refuge were for people between the ages of 4 and 18, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Rob Fitzpatrick. I was previously the director of the Children Teens program and got to work with Caitlin a lot, and so proud to see her taking that program to the next level here. Like Amy mentioned this morning, just recently I started at Williamson County Juvenile Services, and we provide some clinical work for folks, whether they're in our detention facility or released on some conditions or things like that. And as Amy referenced, I'm sure you guys know, there's long waiting lists everywhere. If you want to get into the Refuge Center or someplace like it, you're talking weeks, if not months. And so the thing I'm most excited about is hopefully providing some counseling or some clinical services to individuals or families while they're on those waiting lists, so we get some change going while they're waiting for maybe a more permanent solution. Along with Dr. Small, I was an intern here. I think we crossed over a little bit. So that was, I believe, 2013. So it's so exciting to see from that point to now where the Refuge is going, or has gone, has continued to going. And I'm very appreciative for what it provided me professionally. So glad to be here and talk about this subject. And I'll let Caitlin get started.
Awesome. Yeah, just like Amy said, that even in the child and teen program, one of the major topics that we see coming in is trauma. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. Even this functional definition of trauma, it's really important to think about those bad events being subjective. So however a person takes that event in or experiences that event is really what matters, and how that's going to be impactful for that person. So what's going on inside that person, how that stress response is activated, is that extreme or prolonged? This really depends on a lot of factors, what's going on, how old that person is. We'll focus today on the younger side of that, but keeping that in mind as we're thinking about what does trauma mean. Resilience is not something that we're born with. I think Trillian kind of touched on that a little bit, but it's something that can wax and wane over time. And we're in luck, though, because it's something that can be taught. And lastly, healing takes place when there's dozens, if not thousands of moments when someone can have these moments to control, revisit, and rework those moments in their life with their safe and empathetic people to revisit them. So I think when we think about how does a trauma show up in a person's life, with adults it feels really obvious. We think about how that's going to impact them, but sometimes whenever that comes up for a young person, it doesn't feel as obvious. But how this can affect their daily lives, even months to years after the event, can look really different. For preschool or elementary age children, it can, or even for middle or high school children, it can be intense emotions, behavioral changes, difficulty regulating, kind of regressing from previously acquired skills. Academic difficulties is a huge one, nightmares, the list goes on and on. If we want to kind of get a pretty clear example, if you think about a 4-year-old, they could begin or return to bedwetting, or have a lot of difficulty maybe meeting those developmental milestones that can be expected of them. Whereas a 9-year-old maybe kind of falling in that middle category, could be overly fearful for their own safety or someone else's safety in their life, that even if they're in a relatively safe situation, that can be something that's coming up for them, or experience a lot of separation anxiety from trusted adults in their lives, which wouldn't necessarily be as obvious to people, whereas we're looking for some of these things in adults. So recently, Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey came out with a book called What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. So kind of the perfect book to talk about today. And how we can move towards post-traumatic wisdom, kind of a topic that Amy brought up. And how the long-term effects of stress will impact a person really depends on how that stress response system is going to be activated. So on the left side, I had to think about it for a second, if that stress response is activated in unpredictable, extreme, or prolonged ways, that system becomes overactive, overly reactive, and it becomes sensitized. But if it has predictable, moderate, or controllable stress responses, it'll have the ability to move towards resilience or tolerance of those things. So young people in particular are constantly sensing and processing information, taking things in from their outside world, and their brain is responding in ways to keep them connected, alive, and thriving. But when they're pushed out of balance, these set of stress responses are going to kick in and be activated, either pushing them towards sensitization or that resilience or tolerance side. So if we're thinking about kind of what does this look like on a situational or state basis, we'll kind of move left to right. But in this calm side, young people can be relaxed, their brain can wander, really having access to what we'll call the smartest part of our brain, the cortex. And then we'll move over to the alert state. The focus is much more on kind of the outside world, maybe a conversation, another person in their life, not so much an internal focus for them. And when a young person is well-regulated, able to kind of keep all of their emotions in check, they're able to stay in this calm or active alert phase for most of the day. But any sort of challenge, threat, or surprise will move them into the alarm state. More emotional parts of their brain take over, will move into that lower part of the brain. And then when we look at the fear or terror state, this is when someone is faced with a true threat as they perceive it, kind of thinking back to that definition of trauma we looked at before. And even lower parts of the brain are going to start to dominate how they function. Problem-solving skills are going to totally fade away. Those are more located in the cortex in those first two columns. And the focus shifts right to that moment that's in front of them. And in that moment, this totally works. But the problem starts to happen whenever someone gets stuck over here in the fear-terror state. And that's from that previous slide. This is where people kind of get stuck if they're over in the sensitized stress response system. So what works for kids when they're in constant chaos, lots of trauma-permeated environments, won't really work other places, thinking like school or other places like that. So that hypervigilance that people experience in the alert state can look like ADHD, resistance or defiance of the alarm or fear states could present as oppositional defiant disorder. Any sort of the flight behavior you see over here in the fear column can get someone suspended from school. Fight behavior over there in the terror can get someone, all the way up to charged with assault. And Rob probably is familiar with both of those things coming into his office. And this is really what happens when the focus is much more on what's wrong with you instead of what happened to you, which is the conversation that Dr. Perry and Oprah were having. So they also kind of brought this really great example of what this looks like, how someone can move all the way from calm to terror in an instant. So a little boy was in the home with his mom when a home invasion happened and his mom ended up being killed. So months later, he and his father go to the grocery store and they're at the checkout and he kind of looks at the checkout clerk and says, my mom's dead, she got killed. And she responds and says, oh, honey, I'm so sorry. And that's kind of the end of the conversation. But the dad kind of got really worried, thinks, we really need to kind of keep talking about this. The trauma needs to get out. We need to keep working through this. So as they walk out to the parking lot, he continues to question the son, kind of prompting him to kind of keep talking about what might have been happening for him. And as this is happening, the little boy starts to rock. He starts crying, covering his ears, rocking more frantically. And all of that is an attempt for him to regulate himself. And so the father continues to kind of want to reassure him, calm him down, using these same sort of reminders. It's okay to talk about mom, everything's okay, like what do we need to say? And immediately the little boy jumps out of the cart and runs into the parking lot because he needs to get away from that. So just in that short story, we see the little boy moving from calm all the way over to fear, where he flees from those memories. So if we look at this chart, figure, whatever, this blue dashed line kind of shows what happens when we have high connectedness, or being able to be with those safe people, and low adversity, and that can move us towards much lower risk of mental, social, and physical health problems. And on the contrast of that, that black dashed line is moving upwards, is what happens when there's higher adversity, lower connectedness, and it's going to give us a higher probability of those significant problems of overall health. So kind of thinking back to that story we just talked about, obviously that father had really good intentions. He wants to be there for his son. He's thinking, okay, let's talk about this, and I know that this might be a good thing to talk about. But what was happening there is that it wasn't the perfect moment for him to be able to talk that through. So when that little boy looks up, he sees this clerk, maybe it reminds him of his mom, same age, same hair color, and it produces memories for him. He has a response of that. And he makes one comment, maybe 5 seconds, and gets a response from her, and that's all that he needs. And he got to control that, which is the important part. And it's through these controllable and brief moments that his sensitized system, if we kind of think back to that other figure, gets to be reset and move towards the resilient system. And so ideally, thousands of these events or kind of moments like that can happen in a young person's life so that they can move from sensitized to resilient. All right, Rob.
All right. Yeah, that's good stuff. I'm going to go back just briefly, and typically I think I would work mostly with high school or college-age males, and I think trauma and challenges come out in a difficult way for anybody at any age. But I would argue that the teenage years are some of the most difficult ones to help and to walk alongside somebody. And there's a couple reasons why, and I think one of the bigger ones, when we do case conceptualization or talk about people, we use a term called chronological age. And the first time I heard that, it kind of seemed like it was a little redundant. Like, what other age could there be besides chronological? But what it's in opposition to is maybe emotional age or cognitive ability. And so a lot of times we'll see particularly 16, 17, 18-year-old that looks like an adult, but they'll have a reaction that's on maybe not so much like the young person Caitlin just talked about, but something that just seems like, I thought we were over this. Like, why are you acting the way you did, like you haven't in years? And probably it's just not a chronological age issue, but an emotional age issue, and particularly people that experience developmental trauma or really just missing out on some skills like a lot of our young folks did last year with very little or interrupted school and social connections. There's a lot of things that are confounding for parents, but there's also ways that we can help them along the way for sure. And the person I'm going to talk about next quite a bit, in my mind right up there with Dr. Perry, Dr. Dan Siegel, does a really good job of explaining what's going on from a medical standpoint. And we'll oftentimes lump things and say, oh, it's puberty, or oh, it's just being a teenager. But really, there's a number of processes that are happening. Of course, physical, but also that mental and cognitive or emotional changes, I should say. And in particular would be our social development. So this is a really important thing that happens, of course, going from young, dependent on our parents, to an independent adult. So there's this bridge that happens, and we have to grow from it, of course. So that happens during the teenage years. And if you scroll through the Refuge Center social media, I think you'll see me at least a couple times talking about one of his other, it's called the Healthy Mind Platter. So another way to think of development for a young person, and this is kind of the extension. So this is the essence of adolescence, what all of our young people need to successfully go from childhood to adulthood. So emotional spark, something that gets me excited, whether it's adrenaline or dedication or some pride or something like that. Social engagement, of course. This is a time where kids will push away from parents. You go from being your son or daughter's best friend to the person they want to see the least in the world, unfortunately. Novelty, of course, is important. What's new, what's exciting, and then creative expression. And you can see how important those can be through the high school and college years into profession, because we want to be able to take chances in our early adulthood. We want to strike out on our own. We want to try new things to find our career and those kind of things. So it's very important. But like anything else in the teenage years, it can go a little bit too far. So there'll only be one question for you guys. And anybody maybe here up front watch the news, particularly the local news, very much? I don't want to use too judgmental a word, but if you had to think about the silliest news story that's been coming out about adolescence, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Well, if you check things out, it's going on in the bathrooms of high schools here and all around the country. It's gone by a couple different names, but what's happening is kids are breaking things in the bathroom, or for me, maybe even grosser, stealing things from the bathroom, putting in their bags and taking it home, which just seems like a recipe for gross germ situations. And I'll be honest, so all of these news stories were from Monday, the 21st, so it's happening as we speak. When I first heard this story, like a lot of people, thought, this is it. This group of kids is the worst so far. If you guys don't know, Plato, before the Common Era, said, these kids are the worst, they don't want to work. So for thousands of years we've been saying this, and I almost fell victim. But if we think about this and we go back to that essence of adolescence, it fits a lot of the criteria. There's some excitement, some getting away with something here, that's the emotional spark. One of the, again, I'll say sillier parts is that they then post it on their own social media. Maybe they try to hide their name, but it's like if you're a graffiti artist and you just write your full name and address, it doesn't really make sense to me, but that's what they're doing. But they want their friends to see what's going on. Novelty, albeit gross. I haven't heard of this kind of stuff happening on this level before. And then creative expression. How big of a thing can I take? How many of a thing can I take and stuff like that? So I can tell you, working at juvenile court in Williamson County, there are for sure consequences, and they're taking it very seriously. But I think it's also a time to think about why are young people doing this. And after we get through whether it's they have to pay money back or community service or whatever the case is, are there things that are not going on that may be pushing somebody to do something like this? One of my roles at juvenile court is to do what's called a risk and needs assessment. So before anybody goes to court or talks to anybody, as long as their parents are okay with it, of course, we just walk through what's going on in their life to make sure there's not some other thing that's happening. One of the key components is what you do in your free time and after school. And it's very disheartening to me, and you guys would probably be surprised how many young people in Williamson County have nothing to do after school and nowhere to go and nowhere to be. And it might be hard to wrap your mind around that, but one of the challenges is, say you're the age before you're able to get your driver's license and you don't make the baseball team or you're not picked for whatever the opportunity is, so you don't have a way to get places and you don't have a place that you fit in, it's really hard to find that. So I'm sure there's some people who are just being knuckleheads, a very clinical term, but I think there's also a lot of people who are just bored and striving and reaching for something, and our young people that have experienced trauma need that even more. They need more of a stroke of some kind of adrenaline or something like that, so maybe that's what takes them from the sideline laughing about a situation to doing it. So as you hear about this story in the coming weeks and somebody tells you how awful the young people are today, you can tell them, well, it actually fits in with the criteria, something's going on. And I would argue, a couple years ago when we did the Ice Bucket Challenge, it fit these same criteria. Now that was for a good thing, this is for obviously not so good thing. The people who know me at the Refuge Center, some of the folks that are here, anytime I did supervision, it was essentially just, hey, this is the book that's Rob's reading lately. Now I would tell him about it. So I can't pass up an opportunity to talk about some books, and some books that I think touch upon what we're talking about here. So on the top left is a book called Changeable by a guy named Dr. Ablin. He has a really unique perspective, and as we're thinking about kids that are having challenges, thinking about how we can work with young people, his idea is that it's a matter of skill, not will. So when somebody makes a mistake, when somebody gets in trouble, when a young person does something that doesn't match their chronological age, don't think so much what's wrong with you. Think what's lacking, along the lines of what Caitlin was talking about. what happened to you possibly. And it's kind of hard to accept that, I'll admit, but if you think about a young athlete, say somebody who's playing basketball for the first time, can only dribble with one hand, has to look at the ball as it goes down and comes back up, and they just go slowly down the right hand of the court, of course what's going to happen? The other team's going to grab the ball, go down, basket against us. Somebody will probably come over and say, hey, why don't you move faster? Hey, why don't you pass it to him? He was open. That person's probably say, wow, I hadn't even thought of that. Or if they thought of that, they probably didn't have enough practice to make it happen. So there's a lot of young people who, if they had better skills of decision making, they would make a better decision. So of course there's going to be consequences, but before we come down too hard, Caitlin talked about a number in the thousands. People need to practice something in the thousands of times. So think about this person that keeps making the same mistake over and over, our child, somebody you work with, somebody you teach. What's the skill that's lacking? Because if they had it, they wouldn't choose to get in trouble, or very, very, like a percentage of a percentage might choose to get in trouble. But even then, I would argue we could go deeper back to figure out why this is lacking. The other thing he talks about, which is something that Dr. Perry talks about in his book as well, is that idea of regulate, relate, and reason. Touching back on what Caitlin mentioned, if someone's in the terror zone, somebody's really deep in fight or flight, particularly a young person, that's not the time to say, hey, if you thought about this, we wouldn't be in this situation, right? It's time to calm down, relax, maybe take some of those tools that Dr. Small just taught us. Take some deep breath. Close your eyes, calm down. Hey, that relate part, it's me. You can trust me. I might, be upset with the choice you made, but I'm not going to kick you out of the house at 10, or whatever the case is. Then we can get to reason, and then we can talk about alternatives. But if someone's in that red fight or flight mode, if we start giving facts and this, and I told you this thing last week, come on, who wants to hear that? But we have really good intentions, just that regulate, relate, and reason part. The next book, What Do You Say? Just came out, I believe, last month. Really the latest stuff, and what it is, it's a neuroscientist and a person that does test preparation for like ACT and SAT, so someone who's studying development and somebody who's in the mix. And if you guys have gone through having a young person lately trying to prepare for the ACT or SAT, it's no joke. Maybe it was as serious as when I took it, but it doesn't seem like it. We really need to get a high number. So they're seeing what pressure does. They're seeing how there can be kind of cracks in the system. This idea has been around for a while, that we need to take time with our children, 1 hour a week, no more, no less, but not the time to talk about chores, not the time to talk about school, not the time to talk about how you talked back to mom last week. Just connect with them on a personal level. And these guys do a great job of explaining how to do that. Again, something you would think, well, I don't have to have somebody explain to me how to talk to my kid or something. I would argue, if anybody here is a golfer, you go through the tedious moments and somebody tells you how to stand. So if we can pay a PGA professional a lot of money to tell us we need to have our left foot an inch this way, we can take time to think about how we talk to our children, and it does really practical steps. This last book, Upstream, is the least clinical, more of a business book actually. Oops, excuse me. But going back to this idea that we have a lot of young people that are just sitting around, and a lot of young people that are susceptible to maybe some negative things. The story of Upstream, you've probably heard some version of it, but it's two people that are on the side of a riverbank for fishing or just hanging out or whatever, and they see a person that's caught in the current that can't get out, that's coming downstream. So of course, they jump in, take her to the side, take him or her to the side, and just as they get to the side, another person is coming down. And it's just this process over and over and over until finally one of the people gets out, starts going upstream. The guy says, hey, where are you going? He says, I'm going to figure out why these people keep falling into the water and do something about it. And I think there's a lot of beautiful things that are happening in our community and in our country and in our world, I hope, like breaking the stigma, like having the best options available for young people when they do have some kind of issue, whether it be trauma or just teenage years or whatever it is. But I would challenge you guys, if you're the leader of a church group, in a neighborhood, in a business, something like that, see what you can do to take these changes upstream. And this book gives a lot of great reasons why or how it can happen, and it also talks about the reason why it doesn't happen. So the reason why it happens very rarely, and everybody focuses on downstream, There's no glory. There's nobody that's going to pat you on the back. There's nobody that's going to put your picture in the local paper to cover something that didn't happen. You can't measure something that never took place. But if you really want to help young people, if you really want to help your community to be a better place, like Dr. Trillian talked about, generations to come, I would challenge you guys to think about how to move upstream and help these young people and help people in general, because we really, really need it. I wish I could talk to you guys for the next 5 hours about these subjects. I'm sure you don't want to hear me talk about it anyway, but if there is a way that we can connect, I'm sure that the Refuge Center has great things going on, great upstream and downstream things going on. And if I can help you guys or talk more to your church or group or whatever, please let me know. Related to what we're talking about here today, I'm a trainer in what's called youth mental health first aid. So that's how to help adults who work with kids, teachers, again, youth group leaders, coaches, whatever, how to recognize what's going on and how to take action to help somebody else. So please connect with me before we all leave. I'll give you a card and we can make a plan to talk down the road.
And like Rob said, this is a snapshot of what this topic looks like for young people. So if you or someone you know feels like they need to talk more about that, let me or Amy or someone else from Refuge know, and we can talk through that. And just like Amy said, that presenting issue of trauma is not just singular to adults, that's one of the Child and Teen Program's #1 presenting issues as well. So we're seeing it. And if you feel like you have questions about that, please let me know, let someone on our team know. There's several of them here today, so just let us know, and we're happy to kind of talk through that a little bit more than just this brief 20-minute conversation. But thanks so much.
All right. Well, Rob, Caitlin, and Trillian have all done such a beautiful job. We are going to take a 10-minute break so that you can grab a snack, refill your drink, use the restrooms, and Kencor gave you directions for where those are located. It's 10:13, so let's be back here at 10:23, and Dr. Ebony Webb will give us our next presentation. Thank you so much. All right, if you need a couple more minutes to get your coffee or snacks, feel free to do that. And this is a get your needs met kind of room, which means if you need to get up even during the presentations, that's totally fine. But I would like to start us back again. We have 2 more wonderful presenters. And so let me welcome to the stage Dr. Ebony Webb.
What an opportunity to be here today. Thank you so much for having me. I so appreciated the speakers before. One, because the content was awesome, and it also showed me that there was no way I was going to be able to read my presentation from that little screen. Okay. So also, if you can't already tell, I am not from the South. I hail from the north, and we have a tendency to talk very, very fast. So I needed this countdown reminder to control my gift of gab because it's powerful, okay? But I am very, very pleased to be able to speak to you about the impact of racial trauma, because in the midst of all the things that have happened, right, over just the year and a half, we've also had an onslaught of televised depictions and incidents of ongoing racial trauma, not just impacting the United States, but impacting the globe, right? And so we have found ourselves in a bit of what we think of as a watershed moment, historically, and also globally. And so I want to talk about how do we transcend, how do we move through this ongoing trauma. This isn't new. It just keeps coming back again and again. And it's also compounded by the current traumas that we are suffering. Now, I work in a private practice here where we specialize in an approach known as dialectical behavior therapy. And the tagline for that therapy is that we help clients build a life worth living. And I love that tagline, but when we're working with trauma, what's so important to remember is that trauma is a thief. and that it takes away not a life worth living, but the sense that we are worthy to live. And so that's the focus, right, that I want us to have as we think about how do we develop and grow in this kind of post-traumatic era and growing through and into racial justice. Okay, so Dr. Ebony Webb, I grew up in a little small town. Now the majority of my family is all north now. They're like, I can't imagine. We fought so hard to cross the Mason-Dixon, right? How could you go south? But let me tell you, Lincoln, Illinois, when you hear Illinois, people think, oh, you're from Chicago. Okay, Chicago is just another state on this continent, okay? It's a completely different experience. I lived 3 hours south of Chicago in a very small town. It was predominantly Caucasian community. My parents moved there because they grew up in Gary, Indiana, and Gary, Indiana was definitely trending down. Gangs and drugs were really infiltrating the community, and they wanted to have a different opportunity for me, okay? But it came at a price tag, and by the age of 5, I suffered many racial incidents every year of my grade school experience. Okay, and my mother also. My mother, who was a local high school teacher, she was a local high school teacher, and she was the only teacher of color in the entire county. And that remained that way until she retired. Okay, so we're talking extreme disparities. My grandparents grew up in Mississippi, Arkansas, the Carolinas, right? And so, you know, when I want to talk about this, I want you to understand I'm not some total representative of all racial traumas, okay? I'm speaking very specifically through my experience, but I hope that this can help create some bridges of understanding and compassion, okay? So the lens that I like to set when I talk about the impact of racial trauma is to think about how do we all live and thrive as humans. And what we understand from developmental studies is that we have to have 3 features. One is that we have to have a secure base. You know, the parents that raise you, the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, okay? You have to have that sense of security, that is kind of the group that you can run to. You also need a safe harbor, right? Your communities need to be safe, right? I remember my mom talking about when her mother brought her up to Chicago, they actually, for a time, were in Cabrini Green. Now, if we think about Cabrini Green, now we talk about the Cabrini Green in horror movies, okay? Cabrini Green has changed in Chicago, but my mom said, growing up, the projects aren't what people thought. They were communities, right? It's changed. So, and she's like, it didn't matter where you went, right? Everybody was your parent, right? If I got a whooping at home, I was getting a whooping down the street from Mrs. Smith, right? And plus I get another one when I got home when Mrs. Smith called my mom, right? That's this kind of community, okay? But also proximity maintenance, being attuned and present. And ironically, even in this time when we have been shut down, right? Quarantined, in this technological age, we can be in a room with everybody and nobody connected, right? The internet has given us an opportunity to escape even physical presence, right, through this digital realm. And so we have many areas universally that we are impacted in these 3 in this time, okay? But let me ask you some questions. So as we look at these pictures here, right? What happens when our children witness their secure bases under distress, okay, and duress? So this is an image of Diamond Reynolds, 4 years old, who was in the car with her mother and Philando Castile when he was shot and killed in Minnesota, okay, 4 years old. What happens when you can't play in a safe harbor with toys, right? In a park, according to those tasked with protecting and serving you. So this is where we have Tamir Rice, 12 years old, shot and killed. What also happens when our children leave our proximity and age-appropriate clothing, which proves lethal, right? So this is where we have Trayvon Martin, 17 years old, killed. And if you can note the dates here, with these events, these were occurring about 2 to 4 years apart from each other. And with social media now, where we are seeing videos and recordings of brutality, right? It's impacting our sense of safety in our harbors, right? In our bases, and how it organizes how we need to be attuned to how we let our children walk out into these areas, right? And even what they wear. So, when I think about racial trauma, first of all, we want to understand that our brains are not actually invested in actual reality. Our brains are invested in our survival, okay? Therefore, whether we are witnessing a trauma or we are experiencing a trauma, our brain can respond the same way. And what we have found through accounts of people, say with September 11th, when the towers came down in that terrorist attack, that the people who successfully escaped those buildings, yes, they had trauma, but their trauma was often resolved faster than those who witnessed the towers going down on the West Coast. Okay, the perception, what if that happens to me? So when we think about this with racial trauma, this is the impact of early generational traumas being passed down in terms of how do we orient, how do we prepare our young people for this happening again, okay? So let's talk a little bit more about brain state in terms of how does the brain learn to encode racism. Now, I went to school in St. Paul, Minnesota at a liberal Christian arts university, and we had a discussion on racial reconciliation and wanting to talk about diversity. And I had a professor come to me and he was like, you know, I just really hate when we have these discussions, right? Because, hey, you know, you go to Baskin-Robbins and there are 31 flavors, but it's all ice cream, right? I'm like, yeah, I love Baskin-Robbins. But I've never been to Baskin-Robbins where there were 30 buckets of vanilla and 1 bucket of chocolate, okay? What makes Baskin-Robbins great is that it has all these different flavors, okay? And so when we think about the problem, this is my experience of what I think a lot of the problem is what was spoken even earlier about the difference between chronological age and emotional age. The United States has a chronological age and an emotional age, okay? When you travel overseas, you start to see how young we are as a nation, right? Early childhood development, small children often assimilate, okay? And what they do when we think about that is like they see a cat, cat's furry, has a little bushy tail, and then they see a squirrel, and what do they say? Oh, it's a cat, right? The child has kind of assimilated that anything that's furry with a bushy tail is all a cat. And it's really the parents' responsibility. It's like, no, kind of nuancing the differences between the two creatures so that the child can start to accommodate differences. So kind of the history in this nation has been that we've been kind of stuck in racial assimilation, which makes it very, very hard for people of varying colors to assimilate well, okay? And so this is how we continue to repeat patterns versus healing, okay? And so when I think about this, I'm gonna throw all this up here because we've learned a lot about brain state here. But I'm gonna tell you a story that will illuminate this. So my grandmother, she grew up in Rosedale, Mississippi, and when she was 9 years old, she was a baseball player, and she would tell you, I didn't do any of that softball stuff that you do, okay? It was baseball for me. She was the only girl on a team of boys, okay? And her best friend, he was 9 years old, when they were playing the game, he hit a home run. And that ball went over, and he's running the bases. And as he slides into home base, right, the umpire is standing there, and then the sheriff, the local sheriff, was standing next to the umpire. And this child, he, slides in, dust gets on the sheriff's shoes. And without any hesitation, the sheriff pulled his gun out and shot him in the head, okay? Grandmother was 9 years old. And she said nobody moved, nobody said anything. There was nothing to be done. She went home, told her mother what happened, and what did her mother tell her? He shouldn't have gotten dust on the sheriff's shoes. Okay? This is how trauma and racism gets encoded. So in that lower brain, where you see the little lizard, we think about our lower brain. We sometimes talk about it as the reptilian brain. Ask the question, will I survive this? And in that moment when my grandmother was on that baseball field, frozen, that's a trauma response, that is a survival response. And in that moment, she did everything that she should have done, which is not to move, not to say anything. Okay? When she went home, what can I learn from this? How do I fix this? Right? Or even, why is this happening? Well, her mother gave her the answer because her mother had experienced this. My great-grandmother was, at minimum, the child of slaves, if not a slave herself. Okay? So, right, why is this happening? Yeah, it happened because there are rules that were broken. My grandmother's resolution to fix it was at 17 years old, she left Mississippi. Okay, and many African Americans fled the South during the Jim Crow era to give their children greater opportunities north. Okay, but it was very important that this story be handed down as a means of talking about this is how we've got to figure out how to survive. Okay, so these pieces get encoded, right, every generation, again and again. Okay, so I want you to be attuned to what are some signs of racial trauma. And I am pulling from the work of DBT in terms of some areas of dilemmas that are very common. So we will see racial and self-invalidation. There can be self-hatred, right? Internalized self-hatred, okay? Longing to assimilate, to look more like the majority, hating one's body for not fitting into the norm, okay? But as well as being perfectionistic, trying to people please, trying to prove one's worth, okay? Another sign can be a lot of emotional vulnerability. What you're seeing in a lot of these protests are rage, right? And anger, bitterness. But there can also be the other side of fragility and vulnerability. When will this end? I don't know how to stop feeling what I'm feeling. As well as inhibited experiencing. So when my grandmother would tell these stories, completely flat in her affect, right? She could tell them and we could be horrified. Maybe some of you felt your stomach drop a bit, dispassionate. But my grandmother had learned that that is how you survive, right? And all of my aunts and uncles on that side of the family have difficulty emoting, okay? And when I tell a story like this about my grandmother, we may say, oh, this happened so long ago, right? But my grandmother just passed away in July. And so when we look at how this has impacted us collectively, right? Being, actively avoiding, checking out, shutting down, these means of survival often turn into ways of being. So how do we break through that? Okay. One, it's important to model it's okay to not have to be so perfect, okay? Validation, I'm going to talk about that in just a few bits here, okay? But when I talk about modeling and owning failure, it's giving people who have suffered so much through their racial identity the permission to be like everyone else. We make mistakes, right? It's not indicative of the community, it's indicative of being human. When we talk about intervening with emotional vulnerability, we have to teach culturally sensitive, right? body positivity and self-care. One of the things my parents worked really hard, hence my name Ebony. My parents had this massive fight when I was born in the 70s. My dad wanted to name me Africa Danielle. I'm like, this was, my dad was deep in the Black Power movement, right? But my mom was like, okay, but we're gonna be living in Central Illinois, right? Now, they came to Ebony, added an I, which created all sorts of confusion a lot of times in my childhood of how to even pronounce my name, right? But it was so important for them to help me appreciate who I was, even in the midst of where I was. But also creating safe environments for dialogue. And sadly, when I think about where those safe dialogues are, unfortunately in this time of isolation it's gotten smaller. Churches often still remain pretty segregated. Historically, churches were safe harbors, especially for communities of color. But we have to create more and more environments for dialogue, right? Because if we learn that being real and in my emotions is threatening, we just keep practicing shutting down, okay? Learning how to model emotions breaks through that inhibited experiencing, right? And being authentic in your reactions, right? Without exaggerating or even minimizing. Some other things we want to look at, the unrelenting crises, which I think we're all in collectively, right? Looking for the uncontrollable events like COVID to the ongoing televising of racial traumas, okay? Witnessing people being brutalized is what we think of as vicarious trauma, and we have all been subject to it if you are turning on your televisions, and of course our young people are streaming constantly, okay? The active passivity, this kind of help, rejecting, complaining, this sense of hopelessness, it's never gonna change. It's never gonna change. And then the apparent competence, right? And what is behind that apparent competence when we're looking at racial trauma is that many people of color experience what we think of as imposter syndrome, right? Someone's going to see that I'm not as competent as I am, but I gotta hold it together no matter what. So with intervening in the unrelenting crises, of course, let's try to control the controllable in our safe harbors, right? We've got to turn off tech, right? In my house, we just agreed, we don't really need to witness yet another example of brutalization to know that brutalization is happening, right? We've got to have curfews to shut down those pieces. And for young people, there has to be a commitment to dialogue and to know what is being ingested. With the active passivity, when we talk about cheerleading, encouraging problem solving, I think a part of what needs to be broken through here is having people who look like the group that's being traumatized, speaking into them with origin stories, stories of inspiration, but also having, again, these spaces to come in dialogue where no one's going to question the validity of your story. They're just going to be here to listen and resonate, okay? And then, of course, that apparent competence. Letting go of this assumption that you should behave a particular way based upon one context. And I grew up with that all the time. I had teachers in middle school who were like, I would have thought you'd been more like your mom. I'm like, really? 13 years old, like my 40-year-old mom. And my mom's like, I don't even know this woman. Who is she talking about, right? So again, but when you're the only, you become like this representative, right? And so being able to let that go and highlight the areas that are growing and being strengthened, okay? So when we talk about validation is a hot topic, right? I have a lot of teens I work with, Dr. Webb, my parents don't validate me. I'm like, well, they're not gonna validate you when you cuss them out, okay? That's not validation. Validation is not agreeing. It's acknowledging what is. And how this can show up is when I sit down and tell a story about something that's happened to me, that what I don't get in response is, are you sure? Are you sure that's what they meant? right? Because that immediately just reinforces, this is why I don't tell these stories. Versus if you were just to say, wow, that was really hard. You don't have to have solutions. What people want is to have a sense that you get them, okay? And that's what validation is. It helps create the conditions for change and challenge. Even if it is, I don't even know how to speak to that, and I'm really glad that you told me. That's validation, right? So we come back to our ideal living and thriving as humans, okay? And when we think about racial healing, right, our safe harbors, yes, we have to have safe housing. We have to have a sense of family. But also with that, within that base, origin stories, oral tradition, and this is something that every single person on this planet has and perhaps takes for granted, right? My story did not solely begin in slavery. There are many other stories, okay? I told you a really hard story on my mother's side of the family, but another oral tradition and story within our family is on my dad's side of the family. My second cousin, his cousin, Thelma Mothershed, growing up in Arkansas, was one of the members of the Little Rock Nine when they integrated. So we have stories of transcendence and healing, opportunities that I now have because of my cousin Thelma to speak before you all, right? And when I went to grad school, and I was the only African American in my grad school cohort, when I graduated, my cousin sent me her Congressional Medal of Honor that she received, right? And it was awesome, and I hold that, right? So our stories are not our end, right? Our stories are continuing, and it's important to hold those and to not forget them. And every person here, whether you have come from Ethiopia or you have come from Ireland, there are stories that inform how you have shown up in this nation, and they're important stories to be told and to be shared. We need mentors that look like us, okay? We need leadership and accountability, right? And when we're talking about healing, in our industry in psychology, we kind of separate things. We talk about mental health, we talk about the mind, we talk about the body. But in truth, the way that our body orients and is experienced is all one, okay? So mind, body, and spirit have to be healed, okay? One of the things I'll never forget that my father told me was that he said, you know, Ebony, racism has made our entire globe mentally ill, right? Everyone has been affected by it. And so there has to be a collective healing, or indeed, we will continue to repeat. So loving ourselves well, loving the people well, right? We've got to highlight the areas where racial healing needs to show up. In schools, I'm very pleased with many of the schools that I've had the opportunity to interact with that are very seriously wanting to have dialogue with young people, right? Because where racial healing can change is with young people. If you look at the watershed moments on this planet, it was often led by young people changing the world, right? My cousin, she was a freshman in high school and changed so much of our experiences, right? So strengthening, education and spaces of dialogue and healing in these areas are very critical. With a secure base, we need consistent presence and safe presence, right? And so where trauma can occur in the home is not only with children being frightened by the images, but also having parents who are frightened or who are frightening. In the onslaught of so much of what we've seen, I've had parents who are just like, I'm trying to hold it together for my children, and I don't even know how to hold it together for myself, right? So we've got to have support for those secure bases as well. With proximity, right? Being attuned, being flexible, adjusting to what's needed, and this is always in flux, as we're also in this pandemic, right? How is proximity good? Do we need more space? But being willing to negotiate, being willing to talk to each other about what is needed. And always, again, having these holistic interventions. What I always tell my clients, when there's been trauma, your mind will lie to you, but your body never will. So as the body goes, so the mind goes. One of my favorite books that I do recommend is The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. It's an excellent book that really speaks to the integration of trauma healing through both body and mind. So we have to have care providers and counselors. Okay? There's no way around it. We have to go through it. So we want to understand, right? Growth from racial trauma does not happen overnight. And understanding multicultural accommodations are very important in listening to trauma stories, because there has been a cost to all of us to this value around national assimilation. Validation, acknowledging what is versus what we think it should be, okay, are the keys to the kingdom. And when you learn how to do this well, right, it opens up someone to change and challenge. When a person, as Carl Rogers said, can accept themselves exactly as they are, then they can change, okay? And when we talk about the brain, as we've talked about today, the areas of the brain that are impacted by trauma are also the most neuroplastic, meaning they can rebound. So if we can commit to each other and ourselves to keep our brains at rest, as we learn how to dialogue through the impact of racial trauma, right, the brain can make new connections and new wirings, right? So it is time to heal. Pain is important, right? Suffering is what we find ourselves in more often than not, but the lessons from pain are invaluable, right? We cannot forget how we've gotten to this point, right? But we can heal from it. So as Audre Lorde says, how we evade pain, how we succumb to it, how we deal with it, how we transcend it. And we have to transcend these patterns. And I always hold out hope. It's just who I am. But it all depends not just on us as clinicians, but each and every one here. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Webb. My topic today is the spirituality of post-traumatic growth. Our senior pastor, Mike Glenn, often says, you're either entering into the midst of a storm, you're either in the midst of a storm, just coming out of a storm, or about to enter into a storm. Which is a reminder, the reality is that trauma, tragedy, crisis is no respecter of persons. At some point along the way, we're all going to experience trauma and tragedy and crisis. My experience began as an 11-year-old little boy. My older brother, 18 years old, was killed in a motorcycle accident. And in one moment, in one day, my family and my life changed forever in that one moment. Trauma. And the question is, since we can't always control what happens to us, we can control the meaning that we give to it. And so that's what I want to think about today. I want to think about how do we find spiritual meaning in the midst of trauma. Now, let me begin by saying that research has shown that post-traumatic growth is not limited to any specific religious set of beliefs. But I am going to limit my talks today to Christian spirituality and beliefs because that's my experience. I come out of that particular tradition. So how do we find meaning in the midst of trauma? The question really is, where is God in my trauma? Why does a loving, omnipotent God allow trauma? Is there a perspective in my trauma that leads to a deeper faith, greater self-awareness, and spiritual maturity? Or will I become what the Apostle Paul referred to as shipwrecked in regards to the faith? For some, trauma leads to a crisis of faith. They simply cannot believe in a God that would allow tragedy to happen. And so any mention of faith or religious beliefs leaves them embittered and cynical. And my guess is you know some people just like that. For others, trauma causes them to retreat into a kind of religious anxiety defense, and they become part of some type of religious fundamentalist movement. These are the people for whom the unresolved questions of why just can't be lived, and so they become hyper-conservative in their religious views. They may seem very spiritual, maybe a lot of God talk, maybe a lot of quoting of Scripture, but if you're with them very long, you begin to realize that all this spirituality is really an anxiety defense against uncertainty. And that's what they can't live with. And then there are others for whom trauma leads to a deepening of faith. The stories of deeply mature spiritual people almost always includes tragedy. The saints and the shamans have lived through trauma. So, my guess is you know some people like that. So the question then goes back to how can spirituality prepare us for post-traumatic growth and not despair? I want to use a biblical story today. I want to use the Hebrew story of Joseph. Now, I'm assuming that most of you know this story, and I'm just going to hit the very highlights because it's a pretty long and detailed story. That may not be a right assumption, so if you don't know the story of Joseph, it can be found in the Hebrew canon, the book of Genesis, starting with chapter 37. I would encourage you when you get home today to go read the story. But the story is simply this. Joseph was the son of Jacob, who had two wives, Leah and Rachel. That family produced 13 children. There were 12 boys and one daughter. Joseph was the 11th son, but he was the firstborn of the marital dyad of Jacob and Rachel, and he was Jacob's favorite child. And the favoritism showed. The other sons knew it, and they were all by a different mother. So here's a family story that begins in sibling rivalry and dysfunction. Blended families are always difficult, but this family was particularly challenging. So one day, the opportunity presented itself for the boys to be rid of their younger brother Joseph forever. They decided against fratricide, but instead they sold him into slavery. Now, Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold. So Caitlin and Rob were talking about adolescent trauma here. He seems to be completely naive about how the boys, the older brothers, hated him. But even at this young age, Joseph had already developed a connection with his inner world of imagination and dreams. Joseph had already had a felt sense of transcendence, that there was a God who was real. And through his own personal dreams, he had already come to be connected to a sense that God had a purpose for his life and for his family. Now, that is pretty early spiritual formation. But that spiritual formation is what's going to serve him well as he goes through trauma after trauma. So he is sold into slavery. Joseph had never worked a day in his life out in the fields. That's one of the reasons the brothers hated him. Daddy protected him for that, but that also may have saved his life because when he's sold into slavery, he is bought as a household slave by an Egyptian official named Potiphar. Now, resilience. You mentioned that a moment ago, Caitlin. Here's a young man that developed resilience. So in spite of this trauma, this tragedy of family rejection and abandonment, betrayal, he rises to a place of leadership in Potiphar's household. Potiphar gives him sort of the keys to the house. He does very well. Over time, Potiphar's wife takes sexual pleasure or attraction to him, invites him into a sexual tryst that he refuses. Because of the refusal, she accuses him of rape. He is convicted of that. He's sent to prison. Again, another experience of trauma, rejection, and betrayal. But somehow, again, Joseph develops resilience, rises to a position of leadership there, even in the jail. At some point, you have to begin to ask yourself, what is the theology that this young boy is using to find this kind of adjustment to life circumstances? There in the prison, he becomes friends with the king's former cupbearer and baker. Both of them have dreams. Again, Joseph believes in dreams. He has a connection to his own inner world of imagination and dreams, and so he's able to interpret their dreams. He interprets that the cupbearer will be restored to a position of power, and the baker will be executed. And sure enough, that happened. When the cupbearer is restored, Joseph says to him, when you get out of prison, remember me. Now there's hope. Finally, I can see that God has worked in my life and I'm about to get out of this place. The scripture says, however, he did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Again, he's the object of rejection, betrayal, abandonment. 2 years pass after that initial occasion before Joseph is remembered again. There in his position of leadership, the cupbearer reminds himself that Joseph interprets dreams and Pharaoh has had a dream that nobody can interpret. So the cupbearer suggests, why don't you get a hold of Joseph? I know exactly where he is. He hasn't moved. He's still in the prison. Go find him. Joseph, of course, interprets the dream correctly again. He has not rejected, rebelled against God, even though he's been through all this tragedy and trauma. He believes that God is the one who can interpret the dreams, and so he interprets it correctly. Pharaoh recognizes here's a young man, because of his resilience, who has developed maturity, wisdom, and discernment out of his trauma. Pharaoh says, you shall be in charge of my palace. All my people are submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne shall I be greater than you. Now he's finally in a place of leadership. He's in a place of authority. What a difficult, tragic life, but finally he's now where he is secure. Years later now, he's reunited with his family. And rather than being resentful, rather than holding a grudge, rather than seeking some kind of revenge, he has a theological perspective. Listen to this. He says to his family, do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me here before you to preserve life. Wow. That is an example that I think of in the Bible, the spirituality of post-traumatic growth. So how did Joseph manage to overcome all of these traumatic events, one after the other, betrayal, rejection, abandonment, and yet comes out of that with maturity, discernment, and resilience? Epictetus, the Greek philosopher, once said, ruin or recovery are from within. Spiritual vision is the ability to believe that there's something beyond the trauma that awaits us. This ability to imagine beyond, I believe, is a spiritual exercise. Joseph could endure betrayal. He could endure betrayal after betrayal because he believed somewhere in the deepest recesses of his heart that God had something beyond what was going on right then. He could imagine beyond. Trauma always challenges our beliefs. It calls into question our theological, our adolescent theology. It tests our comfortable spiritual assumptions, and it often leads to what the 17th century Spanish saint John of the Cross referred to as the dark night of the soul. In his book, The Emotionally Healthy Leader, Peter Scazzero says, "A dark night is an experience of spiritual desolation and the ordinary way we grow in Christ as leaders." Wow. You mean there's not much growth if you don't go through some kind of dark night of the soul? It will take you to a different place of maturity. It is a terribly difficult experience to have your beliefs tested. But for those who are able to engage the dark night, to rethink, reimagine, and believe, spiritual transformation is possible. Rule: to relearn, to unlearn, and to learn, to rethink, to reimagine, and to re-believe. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, once wrote, "The greatest problems in life can never be solved. They can only be outgrown." Spiritually mature people have outgrown their life circumstances. Albert Ellis was the founder of Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, REBT. Ellis believed that there's always an actuating event. In this case, we'll refer to it as the trauma. There are certain beliefs that you have around that event. In this case, we'll refer to our theology. And then there are consequences that are a result of that. So the ABC of REBT. So the trauma surrounded by your beliefs lead to consequences. What that means is if we're going to use our spirituality for post-traumatic growth, we've got to examine what those beliefs are. There are some beliefs, I believe, that are not helpful for growth. One of these would be a loving God does not allow evil to happen to good people. It is very difficult to reconcile a loving, omnipotent God and evil in the world. Why does God allow these things to happen? The Jewish wisdom literature addresses that very question. If you've ever read the book of Job is constantly asking the question, why? Now, if you've ever read that book, you also know that Job had these friends that showed up who were basically preaching him the book of Deuteronomy. If you do right, God blesses. If you do bad, God punishes. Obviously, you've done bad, they're basically saying. By the way, we often hear about the book of Job as being a book about patience. There's nothing about Job in this book that's patient. He's constantly frustrated with why. He's asking God why continually. At the end of the book, God finally shows up. And he responds and says, Job, where were you when I created the world? Remind me what you know. Job falls down and worships, and that's how the book ends. We are never told why. And I think that part of the wisdom of that, the Jewish tradition of wisdom would say, you live with the question why. If you can't live with uncertainty, you're never going to grow. And so that's one of the reasons why I think this is a very difficult position for people to have. It is not helpful. Another unhelpful thinking is, if I'm experiencing trauma or tragedy, I obviously deserve it. Difficulty is not always punishment for sins. And my example here is going to be, Jesus was crucified as a political prisoner by Rome. They saw him as being problematic to what their positions were. They didn't need another problem causer in the kingdom. Jesus was without sin, and yet he was falsely accused, arrested, beaten, and crucified. So just because you're experiencing trauma doesn't mean you necessarily deserve it. And then finally, a third thought that is not helpful. If life is easy, affluent, and comfortable, we're blessed. But if life is hard, we're somehow cursed. Don't confuse outward prosperity with spiritual progress. Now, these are some religious assumptions that are not helpful. By the way, there are a lot, but these are the three we're going to look at today because of time constraints. There are some religious assumptions, I believe, that are helpful for post-traumatic growth. Let's start there. Number one, God cares for you. Regardless of your life circumstances, that challenge where God is. Where's God in my trauma? You can always look back to the story of the Christian cross as an affirmation that once and for all, that's the one place God said, I care about you. If I'm willing to die for you, I care about you. And I will tell you that as an 11-year-old boy, I lived most of my young adult life wondering, why did Mike die? What's interesting about that is he was killed. He died at the age of 18. I surrendered to the ministry at the age of 18. When I was 36, 18 years later, I was in therapy and began to ask the question, why did I do that? How did that event shape the rest of my life? And I could always look back and say, God was not punishing me. God may have had a bigger story in mind. And one time I finally came to the conclusion, when I asked the question why, I heard God say, I weep too over that trauma. And that was sort of a breakthrough for me. Never said why, but I weep too. God cares for you. Number two, I think another helpful assumption, theological assumption is God does want the best for you. The Apostle Paul once said, for we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. That is a profound statement that God is working for our good throughout the course of our life, regardless of life circumstances for us. And finally, spiritual maturity faces crisis with confidence, knowing that it's not the end. Crisis produces maturity. Trauma is never the end of the story unless you die. Trauma is the next step in your life journey. And Christian theology says loss is followed by resurrection. In other words, endings are opportunities for new beginnings. Where is the new beginning? Where is the new opportunity? The story of Joseph is just one example of someone whose spirituality, early spiritual formation, produced growth even in the midst of trauma. None of us is going to ever seek trauma so we can grow. That's not the point. It will find you. None of us can avoid it. You are either in the midst of a storm, coming out of a storm, or about to enter into the storm. But when the storm comes, there will be an opportunity to grow and develop maturity if you can have some theological, spiritual assumptions that give you hope. Amen.
I am so proud of and thankful for the speakers this morning. Not only have they brought wisdom and education, but also I think some really healing words were spoken. So we're going to actually invite all of them up to the stage. We're going to grab a couple chairs. I think we have some helpers for that. And we're just going to do a 10-minute Q&A. So there's going to be 2 people in the audience with microphones and can walk around if you have questions for any of our speakers. So give us just a second to transition and think about any questions that you'd like to ask.
Perfect. And I think we're supposed to use those too. Okay.
There we go. All right, let me just have those with the microphones raise their hands. Patty's got a mic, and Sarah's got a microphone. Okay, great. So I think we have a question from the back.
Thank you. So 2 things. First, Ken, crisis produces maturity, and then right after that you said trauma is the, what was the line after that?
Say it again, Jeff.
When you were speaking of crisis produces maturity, and then right after that you said trauma is the
I don't remember, actually.
Okay, so this is a question on the rethink, unlearn, and learn component. To the extent that trauma can happen at any age, if you can visualize trauma as being a nuclear device detonated in your life, and if you survive that nuclear device, you can be said to be a survivor, but you are forever physically and emotionally scarred. And I was just wondering what part of the post-traumatic growth deals with looking in the mirror and coming to the realization that you are permanently, emotionally or physically scarred. That's my question.
That's a beautiful question, and I personally think that you are right. There are times where we go through things and we feel like there's no bouncing back from that. This has scarred me for life with war, with rape, molestation. Sometimes people feel like this is permanently how I'm going to be. I have a little bit of hope though, right, especially with neuroplasticity. And I firmly believe that there are times, of course, with God's healing and also with science and neuroplasticity that you're not doomed. Right? You can have the greatest traumatic experience. Yes, it can shape your experiences and your thought process and your emotion. But with neuroplasticity, which simply means you can alter your brain, you can alter the way that you perceive what you've gone through. I do believe that you're not permanently scarred based on whatever the traumatic experience was. So hopefully that answers your question. I think it's a little bit more challenging. Let's say if the trauma has occurred when you were early on in life and you've lived your life based on the outcomes of that trauma, it can be much more difficult. But it's just the same way as a river can cut through a rock, but it takes consistency, right? Consistency, running over that same thing over and over again. I personally had PTSD as well, and extreme anxiety, but because I was refusing to say that's my lot in life. I was refusing. So with much challenge and work, I was able to create a new direction for my life. You still can revert back to your old default system, but you simply redirect yourself, redirect your focus. So I don't think you're permanently doomed based on whatever your past experience were.
Elizabeth Lesser wrote a book called Broken Open, and she essentially says there's two kinds of people in the world, maybe an oversimplification, but she said there's once born and twice born. The once born person suffers and experiences loss and hardship, and they grow cold and numb and limp around with it forever. The twice born person, she said, sits in the ashes and digs for their soul and rises again, transformed and reborn like the phoenix. So I think we do all have that choice, and a lot of it is the story we tell ourselves about our suffering. Next question. Yes, okay. Could we get a mic up front? Thank you.
Thank you. Ebony, I'll direct this one to you. For those of us who identify as highly sensitive people, any tips for us on how best to cope with witnessing trauma? I feel like even I don't have to witness it, I just have to hear about it or glimpse it or hear about it third hand, and I'm wrecked emotionally.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So when we're talking about even that innate sensitivity that just comes from our temperament without trauma, what's very important is to recognize that the sensitivity is housed in the body, and our emotions are informing that, and so the path to managing that is through the body, right? So we have stress and we have stressors, right? We can't get rid of the stressors that are coming, but we do have a responsibility and the ability to manage stress in the body. So if you know within yourself that you are highly sensitive or have a heightened sensitivity, then you really owe it to yourself to care for your body, to keep it calm and regulated through movement, nourishment, and rest. A large part of recovery is rest. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that great question. What else? Yes, Thomas.
Hey, thank you guys for all doing this. It was great to listen to. My wife and I were just having a conversation. We've been dealing with some issues with our oldest, who's 14 in middle school. And I was, for Rob and kind of the teenage stuff, can you speak to kind of what you're seeing across the board with maybe developmental delays or maturity issues in the current middle school group because of a year and a half of being pulled out and not having the benefit of that social engagement interaction? I think there's a lot of boys in particular who are struggling with a lot of different issues right now, and I just want, like, it would be helpful for parents to have more of an awareness of what they need to do to speak into that.
Yeah, and that's happening without a doubt for a lot of different reasons, and it's such a fertile time for changes to happen and growth and connecting with people and things like that. I think if there was one thing I see the most, there's this concept of the window of tolerance that we use a lot in counseling, and it's this idea that we all have one, and if I'm in my living room watching my favorite program doing something like that, my window of tolerance is huge. It would have to take an earthquake to get me really upset or something like that. But the first day of a new job, you're going for an interview or something like that, your window of tolerance is about this big. You know, you take one wrong turn and you're cursing yourself up and down or something. And so I think collectively, if anything, all of our windows have narrowed because, and I think particularly with the uncertainty, and nobody knew what was going to happen, but with the way school happened last year for most of us, particularly in this county, going for a week, we're not going for a week. We're going for 2 weeks, we'll get in, we're hanging out with our buddies, and we're going home. You know, so that kind of going back and forth, we had to be more sensitized to things. So as we can, helping people to develop an awareness for where they're at, and young people, I mean, when folks are really little, you guys probably all know if you've cared for a young person or raised a young person, you need to remind, hey, have you had any water? Have you had, you know, just the basic stuff, because they're just go, go, go. And I think there's probably a little step back into that, so developing awareness, reminding people, like Caitlin said, those repetitions and things like that of, hey, it's not the end of the world, come on, we'll do it, and hopefully we'll see that window start to open back up again too. Not expert levels as a 14-year-old, but a little bit bigger, hopefully. Yeah.
All right, 1 or 2 more questions? Yes.
I'm in a space in my life where I'm 42, and I'm in a space where I am going back in my life to deal or face some childhood traumas. And I'm a Christian, so I'm, leaning on the Holy Spirit to help me in how to navigate through it. But is there any advice on some healthy steps to take to keep going forward on this journey of going back? Because we're reading a book in our Bible study called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzaro. And so it has a chapter where it says going back in order to move forward. So I was doing this before we even started reading the book, so that was a great tool to help with some things. But do you all have any other ideas on how I can continue on this in a healthy way?
That is such a great question, and I'm going to put all of our speakers on the hook to answer this one, and that's how we'll close out. So, Trillian, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so I'll say for me personally, it started with self-love. I didn't know myself. I didn't even know that I didn't like my little girl on the inside because she was the vulnerable part of me. And for me, it's like, no, you're strong. You got this awesome resume. Don't show weakness. And it was at the Refuge Center, actually, with my supervisor, Lauren Capozzi. I began to learn what it was like to be vulnerable, right? And it wasn't until I can look my little girl in the eye and say, wow, you're really hurt. That really hurt. And I began to love on her, and that's where, like a boomerang, right? Not boomerang, slingshot, the other tool. The further back you go, right? It's painful, but it's setting you up for a beautiful release. And so for me, I would just say, if you can just love on yourself, love on that little bitty person, and the vulnerable part, and you may be ashamed of it, but it's just sit with it. Just sit with that part of you, and that's where my greatest healing has come from. Vulnerability is strength.
To self-love, I would also say
I'm a huge, huge advocate for self-care. And going back to, like we were talking about this book, The Body Keeps the Score, we can acquire so much knowledge about what has happened to us, and we can know it, but you have to sense it, right? And so, and it can take a toll. So there are many people who go through trauma treatment, but physically are worse for wear. And so you have to have a rhythm and routine of self-care, nourishment, hydration, movement, and rest to incorporate what you are healing, because the body also has to work through what has happened and what you've carried. So,
Yeah, I would add to that that it's really important to have patience. That I'll come from a child perspective of that, but working with our inner child, that it's really important to scaffold what that experience looks like. That when we start to learn about these traumatic experiences that maybe we've had in our childhood, it feels really eager to address all of it at once. But what will be most helpful if we're patient and start to open that window slowly, and then we'll eventually get to kind of that bigger and more holistic view of that. So being able to take little pieces at a time, be really patient with our child self and our inner child, and not needing to drink from a fire hose right at the beginning.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some good points so far. I think the thing that came to my mind when you asked that question is conversation I'll have with a lot of people and a lot of families and things like that, that there's therapy that usually happens once a week for 50 minutes out of your whole week, and then there's therapeutic activities. And I think there's an advantage to be older and wiser if you can be honest with yourself, that knowing that this activity I'm going to do is therapeutic versus an escape or something I lean on. So to just, as I think all of us have said, some version, to look within, to know what we need, but then to remember that the metaphor I usually use if we're trying to learn a new language, and you sit with a tutor once a week for an hour, it's probably going to take you a long time, or you may never learn that language to get to a speaking proficiency. But if you use it every day just a little bit, you're going to acquire that new language a lot quicker. So I'd think about therapy plus therapeutic activities.
Yeah, if you survived childhood trauma, then you developed some anxiety defenses that served you well. That's how you were able to survive. Over time, anxiety defenses begin to come down. It takes a certain amount of energy. I believe, now again, this is coming out of my Christian spirituality, the Holy Spirit brings those down when you're ready to face some of your past. And so I would say embrace this as an opportunity to learn. What is it I need to learn? I use a little model, insight leads to change, change leads to healing. So it really starts with insight. What can I learn about myself? And I'll give you just a real quick example. I mentioned my experience as an 11-year-old boy. I lived with a traumatized mother. She did not get over the grief. So just to give you all an example that he died when I was 11, I learned to drive in the cemetery when I'm 15 because she still goes to the cemetery every day, 4 years later, every day. And so the way my anxiety defense was, I learned to distance myself from any kind of pain. So when mother's in the other room crying, I'm in my room, the door closed. I didn't deal with pain. And really learned to kind of shut down all my feelings. And that served me well. I survived. That served me well until I got married. And then I had a wife who wanted me to stay present when she was, and I literally couldn't. I couldn't be present with her. And it was my wife, Denise, who said, Ken, you need therapy. So I would tell you that it is helpful to have either therapist or therapeutic activities as you go through this to be able to process a lot of that stuff. Or just have a good friend that you can take and have coffee with once a week that's not trying to fix you, not trying to change you, but can listen empathically to you as you work this out. But I do believe the Holy Spirit's going to bring up what you need to know as you need to know it, and then you're ready to deal with it. And it may be very painful. Again, it may challenge some of your, as I referred to my adolescent theology, none of that served me well when I tried to figure out what's happened and why. By the way, I bet you every person in this room has childhood trauma. I mean, that's shaped all of us.
I think it can be very easy to come onto a stage and feel like you've got to be the expert and to know everything, and we certainly have a panel of experts here. But each of them has been also very vulnerable and transparent today in sharing parts of their own story. So let's just thank our speakers for their time. All right, you guys are done. Well, we're going to wrap this conference up. Thank you to each of you who attended. If you would like to know more about the Refuge Center, one of the things we do is every other Tuesday, the 1st and the 3rd, we host something called a Connections Lunch, and you can come for 1 hour, 12 to 1. You'll receive a tour of the organization. You'll come into our group room. We'll provide you a free lunch, meet some of our staff, and then perhaps you have things going on at your church or business that you'd like to know us to know about as well. So you can RSVP for a Connections Lunch at therefugecenter.org/lunch, and we'd love to have all of you come lay eyes on our facility and meet our team members. There are some cards on the table today if you are interested in making a gift to help us further our mission and continue to serve more clients on a sliding fee scale. I will say that we are now gratefully at a point where we are able to get new referrals in within about 2 weeks of the call. So if you know someone who needs help or support, yes, thank you, Thomas. If you know someone who needs help or support, please don't hesitate to have them call us at 615-591-5262. And thank you all for being here. Have a blessed weekend.